Okay, I think we can start with the introduction and I think people can join in as they come. So let's just begin. First, the obligatory housekeeping rules announcement. If you can all keep your microphones on mute, and when the talk is over, you can ask your questions through chat, or you can raise your hand and I will call upon you for that. Okay, so I'm Dr. Rashmi Varma, and I teach in the Department of English and Comparative Literary Studies at the University of Warwick. And I want to extend a very warm welcome to all of you to the first seminar of the Critical South Asia Group at Warwick for the year 2021. This is just the second year of our formal existence as a group, and we are grateful to WICID, Warwick's Interdisciplinary Center for International Development, for hosting and sheltering us. We now have a separate public page on Facebook. So please, if all of you can go to the page and like it, that will be a good source of encouragement for us and will enable you to follow our programming. Thanks also to Maeve Moynihan and Jayanthi Lingham for all the tech support as well, without which we would not be able to hold these seminars. I also want to say that if you are tweeting about this event, please do mention Wicked Warwick. Okay, so let's move on to welcoming our guest for today, Professor Mary John. Mary is based at the Center for Women's Development Studies in Delhi. She has been an important figure in the fields of women's studies and feminist politics in India, having previously also served as Deputy Director of the Women's Studies Program in JNU. She has published widely on a range of issues, including on women's labor and family and gender planning, and has authored a number of influential reports on sex selection and higher education. Of particular note has been her interest in the field of women's studies, how it's institutionalized, what its contours are, especially in the context of India. Today, she will be speaking to us on rethinking child marriage in India. So welcome, Mary. Um, and thank you for taking time out for us. So I think you will speak for half an hour, 40 minutes.
Yes.
And
yes.
then we will have, 15, 20 minutes for discussion. Okay. Oh, somebody said my voice is very low. Okay. Hopefully, this won't be a problem now, since Mary is the main speaker. Yeah.
Rashmi, sorry to interrupt. I can hear voices fine. So Mohammed and anyone else, it's a really basic thing. Maybe if you try turning up your volume, which was a problem that I had before, that seems to work.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Jayanthi. Okay, over to you, Mary.
Thank you, Rashmi, for that very warm welcome. And thanks for this opportunity to present my work at the Warwick Network of South Asian Scholars, and to Shirin Rai in particular for inviting me. Forgive me for beginning on a personal note. We are altogether too conscious of living in the times of the pandemic. I lost my father to COVID-19 exactly 2 weeks ago today, and have just made my way back to Delhi and my working life here. He lived a full life and went peacefully. And I know that he would not have wanted any of us, his far-flung family, to postpone commitments made before. So here I am addressing you all through technologies that have become household names only since the pandemic. I would like to take this opportunity not to present a detailed paper, but rather to share in broader outline the questions and directions that my work on child marriage has been moving in. This is work that has been undertaken in several interrelated registers. a critical review of historical and contemporary scholarship on India, a comparative account of the kinds of concepts that a study of this nature must be cognizant of, including marriage, the child and childhood, adolescence and the girl, a statistical analysis of the major data sets on the subject, principally the most recent round of the National Family Health Survey of 2015-16, and finally, field-based research that is ongoing. As I've explained in the introduction to my forthcoming book, Child Marriage in an International Frame, a feminist review from India, when I first began this new field of research some years ago, available scholarship was more than unusually uneven, with certain historical periods, such as the colonial period, the subject of rich and ongoing explorations, and certain disciplines such as demography in the present time occupying hegemonic positions, much to the neglect of others. What I had initially envisaged as being a short and swift review exercise turned into a much longer journey with many unexpected twists and turns. By way of organizing my presentation today, let me begin with a somewhat telegraphic enumeration of what I found and where questions and critiques took shape. Firstly, historiography on the colonial period was a humbling experience for someone like myself who had spent a lifetime in the field of women's studies. The history of women had to be recast yet again to reveal the complex figure of what I have called the child woman / woman child dyad. Have women never been adults in the independent sense of the term, or should one say that they have never been allowed to have a childhood? This was my way of coming to terms with the history of women who figured primarily through the huge controversies surrounding the child widow, infant marriage, and the first girls who went to school. Though this figure may well have been the other for the colonial civilizing mission, this became the story of the self of the Indian women's movement in its critical formative phase in the early 20th century and to subsequent generations later as well. The discursive terrain of child marriage was more obviously framed by notions of culture, primarily the injunctions of Hindu Brahmanic texts, and nature, newly emergent medical and biological sciences, in which chronological age came to be a critical third term. This was true both in the age of consent controversy of 1891 and the reverberations around Catherine Mayo's Mother India and the Sharda Act in the late 1920s. Missing in existing accounts was a recognition of caste as a critical regional differentiator. Thanks to the writings of Jyotiba Phule and B.R. Ambedkar that are now available, otherwise regionally similar debates in colonial Bengal and what is now Maharashtra could be seen to be markedly different. Indeed, in Phule's call for social justice, not social reform, it was caste, gender, and labor together that needed to be transformed through an anti-Brahmin educational system if child marriage for the Shudra, Atishudras, and for Brahmin girls was to end. After independence, and especially with the onset of a new moment in the history of the women's movement and feminism in India, these concerns that once rocked continents receded from view. Child marriage became the memory of past generations for new female selves, modern middle-class women, even the most self-reflexive ones, who, if they did marry, did so as unmarked adults. For post-independence Indian feminism, child marriage became the problem of the other. Backward regions, subaltern castes, minority communities, contained within the problems of poverty and underdevelopment of the newly formed third world nation. When in 1978, right after the national emergency was lifted, the age of marriage was raised to 18 years for women and 21 for men, the explicit reason given in the revised law itself was that of population control, and it barely created a ripple. Though there were subsequent critical events that did directly or indirectly have something to do with child marriage, such as the Amina case that unfolded in Hyderabad and Delhi in 1992, and Bhauri Devi's gang rape with a court judgment in Jaipur in 1995, these were contained within the problems of Muslim minority or regional lower caste practices. When in 1990, a new figure, the girl child, emerged in development policy and for feminism, her endangered status became most closely aligned with another and quite distinct modern practice, female feticide as it was initially called, or gender-biased sex selection as it is now referred to. This is the Indian historical scenario that sets the stage for the 21st century with its global rekindling of focus on the quote-unquote harmful practice of child marriage, to use the language of the United Nations and its Sustainable Development Goals. Organizations such as UNICEF and UNFPA played key roles in staging a new frame for eliminating child marriage globally, that of the violation of the rights of the child on the one hand, but which came entangled with associated dangers, quote unquote, of rising fertility rates and reproductive health risks on the other. But before moving further into the contemporary Indian story, I needed to gain a better perspective through a necessary detour of sorts. Given that our entire vocabulary and modes of thinking on the subject have come from Euro-America, how should we think about the concepts that have been central to this investigation, marriage and the child, and more recently, the adolescent and the girl? Time does not permit an account of these aspects of the journey I undertook. Many surprises lay in store, including the ubiquity of very young ages of marriage in the legal statutes of Britain and its colonies well into modernity, and the presence of child marriage to this very day on the margins of two of the world's most powerful nations, the USA and China. I also encountered the double bind of the child, woman, woman, child, which was by no means uniquely colonial or Indian, at several moments in the history of Western feminism. In the writings of Mary Wollstonecraft in 1796, for instance, in the 19th century history of child brides in the US, in the pages of Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique in 1963, and in contemporary ethnographies such as that of Julie Betty's high school students in present-day California in her wonderful book, Women Without Class. Equally insightful has been a very new feminist literature, some of whose titles are, for instance, Feminism and the Politics of Childhood, Friends or Foes, ? This is a title of a book edited by Rachel Rosen and Catherine Twamley, indicative of lines of tension, if not possible conflict, in what is after all a set of relationships between the slippery categories of women and children across the globe. It is this kind of armory that made it less daunting to wade into the contemporary situation in India. India has by far the highest population count of all those who have married before the age of 18. 100 million according to Census 2011, of whom 85 million are women and girls, and 5 million if we go by the figure of those who were below 18 years and married at the time of the census. It is here that I discovered that our problem was less the ongoing presence of child marriage in our midst than the extremely uneven resources available for addressing it. Three distinctive interrelated domains completely dominate the Indian scene today: law, state policy, and when it comes to research, the insights and limits of demography. Feminists in India have only extensively engaged with the first of these, and there is something of a larger epistemological vacuum within which child rights activists and NGOs are now operating. All these domains converge quite decisively on the age of 18, such as the age of consent for sexual relations, the age of marriage, state policies on the girl child, and calculations of fertility and reproductive health risks all come together to regulate and at times criminalize women and girls in highly problematic ways. There is a paucity of feminist interrogations within the highly influential field of demography. I have therefore ventured critiques of some of this research, especially when they carry the authoritative stamp of top journals such as The Lancet. Articles typically combine a very selective and ambiguous language with highly sophisticated statistical techniques. In spite of using the careful language of associations between adolescent pregnancy, on the one hand, poor living conditions, poor health services, low levels of education, undernutrition in the mother, and factors such as stunting in the firstborn child, and in spite of several caveats in their conclusions about directions of causation between an adolescent mother, poverty, and the health of her baby, final recommendations make it clear that the principal cause is somehow the adolescent pregnancy itself. It is here that I have offered my own independent analyses of data sets of the most recent fourth round of the National Family Health Survey, NFHS 2015-16. This is the largest and most recent source of national data that can be analyzed at the unit level with information about age at marriage. I can quite unambiguously state that of all the factors that affect the health and well-being of mother and her newborn child, the age of her marriage is the least significant when controlling for other factors. This cannot be overemphasized when today, more than ever before, pressures and funding are making child marriage the prime suspect and root cause of fertility and health matters, and not only in India. The World Bank has undertaken a massive exercise to estimate that there will be $5 trillion in savings on public health costs by eliminating child marriage across the world, with such savings based overwhelmingly on reductions in fertility. Side by side with these kinds of agendas, a distinct kind of analytical apparatus is in evidence when it comes to contemporary approaches to child marriage. There is the ubiquitous resort to social norms and to notions of adolescent quote-unquote agency. Again, lack of time does not permit me to enter into the details of my critique of these entry points. The notion of social norms is particularly flawed in that it sees child marriage as a distinct behavioral practice due to the false beliefs held by families that make children unique victims. The solution, therefore, is the communication of the right kinds of information to such families to enable them to abandon such norms. Adolescent girls and their sexuality have also, in the last couple of decades, entered the core of neoliberal development discourses, displacing a prior focus on women in poverty alleviation programs. Education till the age of 18, hence requiring inputs beyond elementary education, is now gaining considerable traction. This is where I would like to set in place my suggestions for an alternate frame of analysis for both thought and action. To begin with, what is the picture when it comes to child marriage in India? I have drawn on statistical data to show the following. A, that child marriage has been declining, especially in the last 20 years, and quite significantly so, according to both the census and the NFHS. And B, that child marriage would be better described today as adolescent marriage, since it is about 20% of those in the age group 20 to 24 years in 2015-16 who married when they were between 15 to 17 years of age, and barely 6% do so at younger ages. These trends, I go on to suggest, must be associated with three others that should be thought about together. Firstly, that of education, seen by one and all as a solution to child marriage and its many ills. Secondly, to the world of women's labor and work, hardly remarked upon by anyone, with, of course, a few important feminist exceptions. And finally, and most critical of all, to what I call the institution of compulsory marriage in contemporary India. To summarize all too crudely, education has been expanding by leaps and bounds in a complex situation of growing privatization to the point of gender parity in many contexts. Already low employment rates for women have been either stagnating or declining further in very recent years. And while child marriage is reducing, if unevenly across different regions, compulsory marriage is not. In spite of the fact that marriage has been such a constant undertow across the history of the women's movement in India, we have yet to address this institution frontally. During social reform, for all the furor that was created amidst repeated cries over giving play to an uncontrollable female sexuality, the dire consequences of flouting scriptural injunctions, or from the other side, arguments about the weakening of the Indian race, the question never really strayed from when and how marriage was to be conducted, and hardly any voices were entertained that said something radically different. So yes, the historical record speaks of the progressive alternatives represented by, say, self-respect marriages in the anti-Dravidian movements of the Tamil-speaking South, where rational choice rather than patriarchal and caste custom would be the guide. There is B.R. Ambedkar's potent call for the annihilation of caste through intercaste marriage, contained within his overall struggle over the stranglehold of Brahmanical Hindu religion. The socialist bent running through the report, the Nehruvian report, Women's Report of a Planned Economy of 1938, certainly included some critical ideas about the rights of women as workers and hinted that women could have a place outside the institution of marriage, but this report was lost to posterity. It played no part in the plans of the post-independence nation state and was accidentally rediscovered by feminists in the 1990s. We do not yet have a narrative, least of all a social history, of the quiet evolution of middle-class, upper-caste women's norms and practices around marriage in the decades following independence into the present, such that child marriage receded as a memory of past generations, and in which educational levels became the most important credential in making caste and community-based marriage alliances. It would appear that when the women's movement re-emerged in the late 1970s and 80s, against the backdrop of the many movements of the 1970s, the default figure whose wrongs it addressed was that of an unmarked adult woman. As I already mentioned, raising the age of marriage to 18 for girls and 21 for boys was pushed by population agendas and not by any feminist campaign. So yes, domestic violence and the evils of dowry were central preoccupations and sites of legal change and civil protections. The whole issue of a uniform civil code versus the ongoing resort to personal laws based on religion in matters of marriage, divorce, inheritance, and adoption became unexpectedly controversial from the 1980s as the country became more communalized in its politics. But here too, we have to pause and ask, how exactly was the institution of marriage itself envisaged in all the arguments over diversity and national integration? When sex ratio imbalances made it clear that son preference was somehow responsible for millions of missing girls, once again, one has to wonder, to what extent has marriage, its structures and expectations figured in all the research undertaken? Feminist economists were certainly at the forefront of naming the failures of development, especially for women in rural India. Here, all the concern over measuring and giving value to the enormous range of women's unrecognized labors that were left out of national accounts and statistical sources once again assumed the marriage relation binding women to their households. When these emerged at all, lower ages of marriage were folded within accounts of greater poverty, social backwardness, and sexual vulnerability. Several studies indicate that young women aspiring for another life, whether in metropolitan city slums or in rural India, nonetheless saw the question of their marriage as one best left to the decision of their parents. One could add to this list, as statistical and econometric analyses have gone to great lengths to demonstrate that marriage continues to be governed by convention, be it contemporary Kolkata's middle classes or at the level of all India preferences. This means that there is something misplaced in the commonplace evocation of quote unquote arranged versus love marriages in the Indian context, as though the latter were increasingly gaining ground, pushing the former to the margins. All that we can say is there are some situations where love marriages can turn into life and death matters. We know a great deal about these since these are much in our headlines and especially in the state of Haryana, while in contexts like West Bengal comes considerable evidence of intercaste eloping couples who do not invite violent reprisals. How then can one place such variation within a larger perspective? Here it is critical to situate child marriage within the paradoxes of the Indian scenario. One that has gained some attention is that expansion in educational enrollments and attainments among girls, with narrowing gaps that I pointed out to, growing parity in many streams even of higher education, have gone hand in hand with surprising declines in women's labor force participation. Indeed, the opposite might be more true, that moments of greater entry into the labor force are signs of pauperization and immiserization. Much less noticed is a crucial third factor that I referred to earlier, that along with paradoxical declines in employment with greater educational access, have also come increases in the age at marriage, if at a rather slower pace. This means that we are dealing at the very least with a three-way dynamic in contemporary India. It therefore becomes all the more vital to analyze the Indian institution of marriage in all its persistent and transformations as an institution at the intersections of several forces, constantly upgrading and modernizing itself. It cannot just be grasped as a customary practice that refuses to go away. This is an institution with very significant variations by region and group, by class and caste, even interpolating those stigmatized for their non-normative sexualities. It is extremely capacious, promising to provide women economic security, but whether it succeeds is another matter altogether, social meaning, sexual respectability, and the only viable space for the reproduction of children. This last is absolutely essential and part of an intergenerational contract. Marriage is for the reproduction of the family. Marriage may on some occasions be entered into for love, but above all else, it is compulsory. There are absolutely no signs whatsoever of its decline as the 21st century enters its third decade. It is demographers and not feminists who have described marriage in India as a quote-unquote golden cage. Srinivasan and James' surprising example is the state of Kerala, known neither for sex selection nor early marriage. Kerala points to some essential characteristics that must be paid attention to. Marriage is almost universal, gender inequalities persist with low levels of labor participation, and divorce rates are negligible. Kerala is not particularly different from other states since its marriage structure is similarly based on religion, caste, and the huge economic and social costs of marital breakdown. Srinivasan and James contrast the Indian scenario with other countries, USA and the UK in the West and Japan in the East. They point out that the institution of marriage in Western contexts has been most disrupted by the high presence of children that are born outside marriage, over 50% in the case of the UK, while it is significant and growing proportions of women who remain single that is transforming marriage in Japanese society. They are quite on the mark when they conclude by saying that, and I'm quoting, one of the contributions of the caste system is the stability that it has brought to the institution of marriage in India, close quote. Caste and religious endogamy are the most responsible factors for India's golden cage, in their view. Another demographer, R.B. Bhagat, has apparently found the image of a golden cage far too benign and replaced it with that of iron fetters. But caste cannot simply be treated as a factor that regulates marriage alliances. As B.R. Ambedkar noted as far back as his 1916 essay on caste, too much is left out from a simple characterization of caste-based endogamy. Caste has a hierarchical and systemic quality whereby marriage alliances are regulated by levels of social distance, structured from above by exclusion and from below by imitation. Writing in 1916, Ambedkar went on to identify child marriage and enforced widowhood as Brahmanical injunctions for women at the top of the hierarchy. The lower the status of a given caste, the less the capacity to imitate these quote-unquote iniquities on women that the caste system imposed. Today, the tables are evidently turned. Upper castes have sufficiently modernized themselves, at least as far as child marriage is concerned, while their less well-endowed lower caste sisters in slums and villages struggle to catch up, too often from locations of profound vulnerability. It is therefore time to recognize the compulsions of the contemporary Indian marriage market with some care. Ours is much more than the institution of prestige encountered in, say, present-day US, or the one that China's leftover women are being pressurized to compromise with. That is why I've described our marriage system as an intergenerational contract, somewhat inchoate and unspoken, but thriving in all its infinite variety, characteristic hierarchy, and deadly monotony. This intergenerational contract is being bolstered from all sides by the secularized caste gradations of endogamy, no doubt, which includes a cosmopolitan English-speaking caste who believe they are casteless, so that marriage has become one of the principal mechanisms for the reproduction of caste. But the reason caste continues to find so much traction in the most modern of settings, as in the worlds of newspaper matrimonial advertisements or online marriage portals, is because India's economic trajectory has made contemporary marriage the primary domain that women are socialized into for their economic survival, experiencing themselves as financial and social dependents. Notice, therefore, that my account of this compulsory institution covers much more than the overly simple rendition of marriage as, quote unquote, the control of women's sexuality that one finds in much of the literature, including in popular stances towards women's sexual rights and greater, quote unquote, choice. Entering or not entering this institution is not just about women's sexual agency or the lack thereof, and cannot be grasped by contrasting notions of consent versus force, however meaningful these might be. Or rather, when girls and women are desirous of greater choices in making their own future, they will have to take on the economic, the social, and the sexual costs of potentially bucking the intergenerational contract as distinct from making accommodations with it. Most critical of all, societies like India with patterns of compulsory marriage are societies where early marriage will be prevalent, governed overall by the form of an intergenerational contract. This should by now make intuitive sense. But what is more remarkable is that this is a situation that is by no means static, but one characterized by slow and uneven declines in the proportion of such marriages. Along with greater expansion in schooling and a closing of gender gaps in education that I referred to, the contemporary hold of marriage has by no means slackened. If anything, declining employment opportunities and smaller proportions of women who are employed, that is, those who receive some kind of remuneration for the work that they do at higher ages of marriage, this is a golden cage that might indeed be better described as iron fetters. Women's critical dependence across social groups and classes has been made much more precarious given the economic crisis that is unfolding globally, however unequally distributed across class and caste hierarchies. This can veil the fact that in the version of contemporary development that India has chosen to follow, marriage, marriage binds all women into households to undertake the tasks of social reproduction, subsidizing capital accumulation by ensuring that women's labors at home will be the hub of our care economies. Other scholars have finessed this care system further as one of stratified familialism. Such a compulsory institution can better account for the much higher numbers of early marriage in India, followed invariably by the birth of a child, compared to the tinier figures in countries like the USA and China. A slowly declining proportion of underage marriages is going hand in hand with more years of schooling, and for some a college education or even a professional degree that provide credentials within this hierarchical matrimonial market, along with the much noted skyrocketing of dowry. Love will also find a place somewhere, even non-normative ones. India's child women are indeed in a time of change, however uneven and constrained from all sides. Middle-class young women negotiate the intergenerational contract in several ways, as do the urban and rural poor, who have to settle for much less. Today's adolescent girls in many pockets of India, the new subjects of international donor agencies and numerous local NGOs, do not want to marry too young. But what more empowering future is on offer for them? I believe that it's high time that everyone, feminists included, recognize the enormity of the challenge before us and refuse to accept either the notion that delaying marriage will transform social norms or that agency, quote unquote, is primarily resolvable through NGO intervention and support for adolescent groups. The internationally driven agenda to end child marriage must be reconceptualized and repoliticized through a critical recognition of the foundational roles of compulsory marriage if genuine change is to become a reality. Thank you very much.
Takes a while to unmute, but and a virtual applause to you, Mary, for that very insightful and wonderful paper. So thank you so much. I think we can open this up for questions and for discussion. Our attendees are invited to post their questions in chat, but can also unmute themselves and ask questions. I had a question, but I think I already see one from Shirin. So I'll let Shirin ask the first question. Shirin, could you unmute yourself? And attendees can also raise their hands and we can call on them. So Shirin. Yeah. I'm not sure you can be seen, Shirin, but you can unmute yourself and ask the question. Oh, she's
okay,
not.
Can you hear me now? All right.
Yeah.
No, I think I was just unmuted now. Mary, thank you so much. It was a fantastic sort of survey of your whole book, and I'm really looking forward to reading it closely and learning from it. So thanks very much. No, my question was really, and you pointed this out yourself, that women's paid and unpaid labor just kind of gets overlooked in the analysis of marriage itself. But my question was really that, what would your argument be about increased labor force participation by women in India? I mean, is the argument that that might lead to decline of marriage as an institution, as we can see sort of in Europe or maybe even Japan? Or is the economic survival of women so dependent on marriage that labor force participation is not an option, especially in times of, the current economic crisis of low employment for all?
Well, it's a speculative question, Shirin, and it would really need to be unpacked, not in a simple, question of that sort. What kind of work participation are we talking about? Would these actually be levels of remuneration and kinds of work that would actually enable women to step back from the institution of marriage or negotiate it differently? Because what we have been seeing is a cheapening, right, of labor. So even where you have pockets of say in Tamil Nadu, you have actually small pockets where you see a kind of industrial workforce, around in economic, special economic zones, in garment manufacture or in, electronics. You have mini, you could look at these as mini cultures, mini factory cultures. What is going on there? It's hard to say, because what is the kind of work that these women are doing? A few years here and there before they are sort of usually prior to marriage. So these are then thought of as ways to collect a dowry for later. Yeah. So what do we have to go with? I mean, we can speculate. I would like to think that we could become more like Japan or elsewhere in terms of a much more mixed scenario than we currently have. But that's a kind of empty speculative question that we could just turn it backwards. You see, you're just reversing the causality. But I think that's not very good social science. We would really need to pare it down and ask ourselves what kind of work. What we do see in the little bubble of the upper middle class, our class, which is a tiny bubble, right? We are like, what are we? 1%, not even 1% of the population. Amongst ourselves, surely we will be seeing women who are negotiating a different kind of status for themselves. But even here, I have been actually quite shocked to see the extent to which highly educated, highly professionally educated women are quote unquote choosing not to work and rather displacing their, whatever you call it, aims, achievements, desires onto those of then children, one or two children, including daughters. So the extent to which, for instance, that's another thought one could have, the extent to which you hear from both poor and better off families, this displacement, constant displacement by mothers onto daughters. It is the daughters that will now have another future. Poor women say this all the time. Hence the incredible investment in education that we are seeing across all migration from villages to towns, towns to cities, all for the sake, very often for the sake, not just only of sons, but of daughters. So I think we would have to break this open into many, many different levels. And then whether, a fantasy world in which there were more jobs for women, in which there are not enough jobs for men, that's our Indian story. What would that look like? Is such an, so it's right now we're having this entangled, what I call, an economic, social, sexual entanglement. And the other point I want to make that struck me only very late was that it's conceivable for women to remain single. It is not conceivable for women to biologically bring into the world a child of their own without marriage. That is not part of our, even not in, in our own class. It's barely, I would say it's at the very edge of conceivability. Whereas being single is, maybe adopting would be, but not having your own child, right? So I think many of these would need to be factored in before we can speculate about what more work and what kind of more work would make a difference.
Thank you very much for making that connection, because I think that allows, as you said, for future research agendas. So thanks for that.
Okay, we have a number of people lined up with questions, and I am going to turn to Prabha Kotiswaran. Prabha, I'm so glad you've joined us here today. And just to let the people who are asking questions know that sometimes there's a time lag of a few seconds before you're unmuted. So, but that doesn't mean much. You will be called upon to ask your question. So Prabha, you can go next.
Hi, so this is actually not Prabha, this is Shakti Natraj speaking. I'm a postdoc who works with Prabha at King College on the Laws of Social Reproduction project. So thank you. She had shared with us the link to this Zoom call.
Hi.
And Hi, hi. So your talk was absolutely amazing, and I just wanted to ask if you could say more about what you think the effects are of the SDGs and their stated goals of eliminating, forced marriage, child
Yeah,
marriage, what they
yeah,
call modern slavery, and,
yes,
trafficking, which, all labor trafficking is conflated with sex trafficking. And
yeah, sure.
my own work has tried to look at a bit of the way there are overlaps in the way marriage and sex work are experienced by sex workers in India, most of whom are or have been married, and also who have been both marriage migrants and work migrants. And there's a kind of marriage exceptionalism that continues to pervade the literature on sex work, where people, treat sex workers as exceptions to wives or polar opposites of wives. And this marriage exceptionism is there in the literature on child marriage as well. I think like there's a recent
Yes,
paper um, which looks at, it characterizes, Bedia practices as of kinship-based sex work as, child sex trafficking, which, there are many ways in which Bedia communities have been pathologized by different groups over the years. But this particular characterization of them as child traffickers in the context of the SDGs in a paper this year, struck me as something kind of
yes.
which makes draws a link between the abolitionist discourse against sex work and these emergent moves to eliminate child marriage. And so I was just thinking, for those of us concerned about the global war against sex trafficking and so forth, are we right to also be keeping our eye on these kind of moves to regulate,
Yes.
marriage and, as both being things that are trying to regulate women's mobility, migration, and labor?
No, very good set of questions. I would say, I mean, I'm being ambitious and going even further. So yes, we need to distinguish the different levels of pathologization that are going on. And you've enumerated some of them, and the tendency to conflate them. So conflations of trafficking with sex work is an old conflation. It's part of the history of sex work in India and prostitution and the laws against it. Now it's being sort of expanded because we are seeing trafficking now include even migration for domestic work are also being seen as potentially trafficked persons. Any kind of migration is being seen as potential trafficking. Child marriage, when the pandemic hit and we had lockdown, immediately there were articles almost, within a very short time in which there was complete, and I can, share some of those with you. They're in my afterword, which talk about how a rise in child marriage is immediately conflated with trafficking, right? So this tendency, it's ubiquitous. It's there amongst reporters as much as amongst others. So I think that is one point that we need to disentangle. But the other, my actual point is to put compulsory marriage on the table. So I want to put on the table not the many pathologies, quote unquote, but the mainstream marriage, including big fat weddings in the heart of, New Delhi. I want those to be put on the table. And I think until we do that, and I'm not doing this out of some empty radical, kind of gesturing, I'm doing it in order to make change happen. Unless some of that is on the table and those alliances and those, exchanges and the money and everything else that goes into the creation and perpetuation and reproduction of these relationships, unless those are on the table too, I feel that we're going to keep on just skirmishing at the margins and query UN and its goals. So so you see, so I'm saying we must do there's a double job we have. We have to disentangle the definitional questions of what is forced marriage. I'm trying to say that consent, my definition of compulsory marriage should not be equated with forced marriage. It is fully consensual. Unless we put that into the frame, we are not going to make major headway, is my argument, really. Meanwhile, of course, you must do what you're doing. That is to say, disentangle those conflations. But I think the one that is being left out of the picture constantly is the one that everybody loves and is getting indebted over, right? That's the one we need to
critique of
put on the
marriage
frame.
itself.
Yeah, marriage. Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Keep forgetting to unmute myself. Somak, you are next. Jayanthi, can we unmute him? Is there a problem? Jayanthi, yeah. Yes.
Okay. Hi, thanks for the really wonderful talk, Mary. It's always a pleasure to read and hear you. Yeah, so I just wanted to sort of square back to the point you mentioned about how the sort of historically, like, it's now that the sort of upper caste have modernized and has managed to kind of overcome that sort of trope about sort of child marriages, right? But sort of ironically, sort of it's the lower caste / class groups that have now kind of taken on this tradition now, and I kind of, yeah, but I also was wondering, since you flagged another point in the beginning of relating such practices to the cycles of labor and work, right? And I was wondering if you could like make explicit those linkages that you between these 2 points about how sort of certain kind of lower caste class practices of child marriage are also tied to cycles of work and labor.
Well, that's the tough story. The tough story is precisely, and that's what's so counterintuitive, that if anything forms, and that tells us something about the place that work and remunerative work occupies in our country. And I think we still haven't got our heads around that it continues to be largely stigmatized. And that therefore the work that a tiny proportion of upper caste metropolitan women do as school teachers and so on in modern India is a small proportion in relationship to the vast majority of those who do work. Within the tiny numbers who get paid for what they do, most of that work is stigmatized. Most of that kind of work is done only out of compulsion. This is what we need to keep in mind. So the strange thing, therefore, is that higher ages at marriage, as they have been developing in recent decades, are going hand in hand with fewer proportions of these group of women working. So this is the paradox. This is the tough part that has taken many, and I think I still haven't got my head around it fully. In other words, the stigma, and that's why I've my other writing I've spoken of the stigma theory of labor in India as compared to the labor theory of value, for us to understand the extent to which upper caste modern women marrying at later ages, a tiny proportion of them are negotiating possible work relationships, but a much larger proportion are really only exchanging their educational credentials, including professional educational credentials, with a place in this hierarchical marriage market. A good place with a man who will deliver the kind of economic security that will go with a certain lifestyle. She may or may not work. That is never essential to the marriage alliance. Younger ages at marriage go hand in hand with a great deal more of unpaid work and sometimes forms of paid work. This needs much more disaggregation. It's also regionally very variable. So in Bengal, for instance, which is the second highest state today in terms of underage marriage, it goes hand in hand with terribly low levels of work, even amongst the poor, even in rural Bengal. Perhaps in urban Kolkata, you will see underage marriage going hand in hand with child domestic labor, for instance, a very ubiquitous practice in Kolkata, right? Girl children who work in homes, who then marry young and then return as live-out maid servants, for instance. People like Shomita Sen and Deepika Chakrabarti have written a great deal on this. So you can have, there can be variations, there's considerable variation. Compare that with, say, Rajasthan, where you will have higher levels of agricultural labor by women going hand in hand with very restrictive caste and gender practices. Or take, Telangana and Andhra, another region the backward section, the backward so-called backward, highly arid regions of these areas, where you can have higher rates of women's labor going hand in hand. That is usually agricultural labor of a very onerous nature, going hand in hand with underage marriage. So how those are being negotiated in each and every case needs to be looked at. But the paradox is that the urban counterparts, that is to say Hyderabad city, Jaipur city, Kolkata, will have much higher proportions of women who are quote unquote not working. That's the part of the story I think that we have been missing a lot in our recent thinking.
Thank you,
I don't know
Mary.
if I've answered your question.
Thank you.
Okay, I think Dishani has a question, and then Anne. Yeah. Dishani, do you want to ask your question?
Hi. Hi, am I audible? My internet connection is not very stable.
I can hear you,
Thank
yes.
you. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Mary, for your insightful presentation. My question is, how do the narratives projected in Indian movies have contributed to the discourse on marriage?
Indian movies. You're asking me about Indian movies? Was that your question? Did I hear you right?
I think so,
Yeah.
Mary.
It's about how do the narratives projected.
Well, I mean, that's another kind of question. What is it about popular culture and love as it is portrayed in are you talking about Hindi cinema? Because we have many cinemas. We have Telugu cinema, Tamil cinema, Malayalam cinema. The one that's, I think, exported the most is Hindi cinema. I'm not an expert on cinema, but the question that in my mind is the ubiquity of love in our films and as film narrative, and what are the ways in which the narrative plot works towards either happy endings or tragic endings in terms of how then the families have to come together. You can read everybody from Madhav Prasad onwards to more recent work. The curious thing is that obviously I would say the curious thing is that they are so, that by having foregrounded love, they are obviously in a different world from the quote unquote real. So, I mean, I'm the world that I've just been describing to you. Moreover, I don't know enough about film to know whether child marriage, I think child marriage can appear in soap operas in various state TVs. And then it's, of course, a deeply sugary social reform narrative very often. But I wouldn't venture to say a lot about, there are obviously registers here of analysis that are needed between the popular and these kinds of developments. And I think what I will say is that it is the popular suffusion of love marriage, including, and let me stick my neck out here, including we in the women's movement, our own, we're living in the times of love jihad after all, right? So including our own investments in love marriages is, I think, partly a problem insofar as we are not recognizing the ubiquity of the ways in which most women are in fact negotiating these alliances. So if we are not being intentional, we are unintentionally perhaps participating in the notion that indeed more and more love marriages are happening, more and more, kahanis as they are being, trotted out in our Hindi films are the stories of the people's lives, then I think there's a mistake here. But I do not think we need to have a reductive real versus, fantasy kind of connect to sort of make the case. I think we need a better analysis, and I think that analysis has yet to happen, between how do we make that kind of connect between what is in the world of cinema or the world of TV soap operas and the worlds that people are watching. And I imagine many today from many backgrounds are watching these, right? So my only point is to say that there's a tendency even amongst us to look for eloping couples as the future. And in fact, they are not the future right now. And I think that's what we need to get our heads around.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mary. Anne, you can go next. And then we have time maybe for one more question after Anne. So if you have it, you can.
So thank you very much. Can you hear me? Everybody always says that, don't they? Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. I'm pondering on the, it's fascinating. I think what interests me particularly is the relationship between the labour market and the forms of economy and marriage. And I'm reflecting on, because I've been focusing a little bit on Africa, particularly Southern Africa recently. And in South Africa, marriage is now in a minority, in contrast to Eastern Africa, where marriage, but those that have looked at this have looked at the way in which the changes in the nature of the migration patterns and full-time migrant workers with relatively stable incomes in the mining industry were able to marry. Now marriage is seen as almost as a sort of traditional marriage with the use of bride wealth, or the equivalent of dowry, is now seen as a gold standard that is to be achieved if you have got that status. It's been replaced by what some commentators, I'm sure you know, describe as provider love, whereby there are liaisons, which are forms, you might say, prefigurative forms of marriage, but actually provide means of economic recompense in ways that aren't the equivalent of marriage, but actually an enabler security. So I think it's quite...
That's very interesting.
Interesting to think about how the intergenerational contracts works in relation to transformations of particular labour markets. And this is in a sense in the decline of agricultural and also secure jobs for those that have migrated in the past, for men in particular. So I haven't got an answer, but I think it is quite interesting to look at, you know, I always ponder in India why, you know, women, the economy has never incorporated women and expanded to enable that process to happen. But yeah, it's just a comment rather than... but
wonderful comment. And I just want to say that, you know, in my own review, there was a lot of pressure on me to include other spaces like Africa, for instance, you know, some of the not South Africa so much as the Eastern, you know, Niger, Mali, all these countries which do have very, very high prevalence rates of early marriage. And I refused to do that because I really felt that unless I had a historical sense of the relationships between labor practices, marriage practices, and other forces, there was no way I was simply going to play off, which is what the UN wants you to do, play off the figures and tell everyone how terrible things are. I think you know, I mean, one can go back to Esther Bostrup or whatever. There is a difference in the sense that, and I think the labor and sexuality questions in several parts of Africa do point to a difference of a sort, and I don't want to generalize, which will sound sort of really foolish on my side. They point to certain differences with our situation, and I think we have not looked at those enough. We tend to simply look at, especially in immigrant contexts, the traditional Indian family compared to the quote-unquote African or West Indian family is a stereotypical contrast that's made all the time. And I think we must bring the labor question in all its concreteness, to recognize why the alliances that you speak of, the provider forms in informal relationships that you speak of, might exist in certain contexts in India, but only very, very transitionally. Even amongst the urban poor, where you do see, you know, movements in and out of marriage a little more, there is nonetheless a very firm intergenerational contract in favor of the boy that the family wants the girl to marry, because those are the ways in which you will have refuge later when things go bad. You recognize that husbands are not going to be necessarily able providers that things are going to break down, that there is going to be violence and so on. And hence you need something other than the couple. And it is the natal family in many contexts that then provides that refuge, which if you were to make your own choices, you might cut those links. And those are significant. You might cut the links, especially with a brother who will not be there for you when you're needed. So we would need to sort of fill out many of these concrete contexts and the labor kinship and other elements. And I think it might be fascinating to look at comparative work if it were done in the fullest possible way. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Okay, we are almost out of time and I don't see any further questions, but could I use my chair's privilege and ask you the last question?
All right.
Politics is on our mind after the Bihar elections, which have just gotten over. My question to you is whether you have seen, I mean, how would you talk about under the current political dispensation, what is happening to this issue of marriage and gender? Because of course, you know, so many of the BJP politicians have been very vocal about marriage and, you know, family and so on. So, and of course, the slogan of Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao. So I was just wondering if you would reflect on
well, sure. No, actually, as it so happens, I don't know if any of this news has percolated to you, but we have a task force that has yet to give its final word. I don't know if you know, but the Prime Minister made the announcement that the age at marriage was going to be reconsidered. And there was a lot of talk of actually being raised to 21 for girls, all in the name of gender equality, believe it or not, that 18 and 21 was a mark of deep gender inequality in our country, and that the only way to sort of make that right was 21 for both, along with all the ostensible health and other benefits that would accrue. So actually we have been very involved, I have been involved in interacting with the government on this issue. I have addressed the task force, I have provided them with all the data, to show that and as I mentioned in passing, that age is not a critical vector here, and that what you would be doing by raising the age to 21 would be to criminalize the vast majority of all women in our country. All, you know, if it's been down to 26%, you're going to jump to 60% of marriages take place before the age of 21. And these are adult women, you know, you're going to criminalize adult women. So the story is actually a peculiar one. It is one where, you know, yes, you have Beti Bachao and all of this daughter stuff and extremely protectionist and patronizing and empty actually of any real content. That is the most important point. The nutrition programs of the ICDS have all been pushed aside and we just have slogans in their place. At the same time, we have this kind of very counterintuitive, if you like, because you are looking at a situation where most people's practices are going to become criminalized as a consequence if such a law were to come into existence. So what's going on here? What is it about gender then that enables the government to play like this, regardless of what repercussions it might have on the ground? Yeah. So this is again one of those, you know, where we are stumped. Very often we are stumped by this government of ours because it's not playing, you know, we're stumped, of course, when absolute suffering is not responded to by protest, right? When the demonetization or more recently the migrations did not seem to take the form of open protest. And even more strange then is this willingness. I mean, many of us have said, if you're so bothered about equal ages, make it 18 for both, make it 18 for both, which is what it is the world over, most places. That they don't want to consider. So and there's very confused thinking on their part because they don't recognize the difference between a certain conventional age at marriage and a minimum age at marriage. So you know, do not be surprised if sometime very soon you're going to get the news that the age at marriage of women has been raised to 21.
Wow. Yes.
This is the world we're in right now. It's a weird world.
And that's the challenge, trying to make sense.
Yes, making sense of this. It's very hard to make sense of it. Yeah.
But Mary, you've given us lots to think about and we're all looking forward to your book. Thank you for taking out the time in these very difficult circumstances. We really appreciate, and our best wishes to you. And thank you to everyone for joining us. And please join us next on the 3rd of December, when Professor Ajanta Subramanian will be talking about the merit of caste. So thanks everyone, and goodbye. Thank you, Mary.
Bye. Thanks very much.